Greetings all, you're back. This time we're going to talk about how we can kind of put some of what we've already learned into practice and how we can create some new behaviors and change some existing ones and kind of tweak them a little bit. First, I'm going to have a little bit of coffee as I look at that nice discriminative stimulus on my desk. The question is, which one's warm? That one. All right. Anyway, fading, shaping, chaining. Here we go. Well, that's kind of cheesy. You can see it. Do I even need to describe it? Take a look at what's on there. I mean, if we were to describe that, how would you describe it? I mean, you're starting with a star and you're ending with a circle, right? So if we were to describe that process of change, you're slowly changing one stimulus into another, right? So essentially, that's all we're going to do. We're going to take one stimulus and we're going to change it into another one. And that stimulus can be all sorts of things. So let's take a look a little further. All right, so gradual change of a stimulus over successive trials. All right? So right off the bat, you should see a couple of things. Number one, we're not going to make gigantic changes here. And then number two, what we're going to do is do this repeatedly, okay, over and over and over again. That's the successive trials part, right? From an existing discriminative stimulus to a different discriminative stimulus, right? You're going to produce the same response. So the idea is here, you're trying to teach somebody to do something, right? And they're already engaging in the behavior that you want, but they're engaging in it at the wrong time, or they're engaging in it in one scenario but not another, and you're trying to get them to engage in that scenario. I've got a bunch of examples on the next slide, and we'll look at those here in a minute. But the basic idea is, one of the basic applications is if oftentimes we're trying to get autistic kids to respond appropriately to particular stimuli. We want those stimuli to be realistic, things in the normal environment. Your book uses a good example about, say, look at me, I think is what the book does. Or, I think the book says, what's your name, right? So the child might be able to describe say what his name is or her name is in one context, but not be able to answer the question. So what we have to do with one of the procedures we could use is fading to address that particular thing. Okay? Ultimately, what we're talking about is transferring the control. So we have one discriminative stimulus that has stimulus control over behavior. Now we're going to transfer that stimulus control from the original SD to a new one. Right? Typically speaking, we're going to focus on one dimension of the stimulus: shape, color, that type of thing, right? Size, pattern, blah, 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 right? And we're going to slowly change that dimension. Right? We can do auditory stuff as well, learning to discriminate fine details in music stuff is partially a fading process. And there's all sorts of things where fading plays a role. So let's look at a couple of those settings here after we get done with this slide, right? But you can also fade across settings. So in other words, teaching somebody to engage in somebody's engaging in a particular behavior at home, but they're not doing it at school, so you could fade out that home to school. And that's a pretty big fade that you would have to do, but you could make something similar. You could have a verbal cue at home or a visual cue at home, and then you could bring that visual cue to school and slowly fade that visual cue out, maybe just a little piece of paper or a wristband or something, who knows. So let's look at some examples of fading, though. Very useful technique. Where I've used this the most, where I've had the most success with fading, is kids with mild disabilities. But autistic kids, they're still functioning, but so maybe people that might be diagnosed as Asperger's might be a good one. You can use fading in all sorts of contexts. I believe it or not, I actually use it in woodwork for myself. Now that I'm thinking about it, I've faded all sorts of things out, starting with some measurement tools and how do I actually use them and kind of the guides for using the particular tool. And then over time, I've removed those guides, and then I can just kind of see what's going on with the particular action that I'm doing, and without having to have that guide there, and it's slowly faded out. There's a whole bunch of examples of this stuff. So let's look at another one. Okay, guidance. Right? So that's kind of the first one that we can think about. How do you fade guidance? What we're talking about here is graduated guidance, right? I'm going to use this woodworking example. Oh well, I do a lot of woodwork, so sometimes those pop into my examples because they're usually fresh in my head. Right? So the first time I teach some woodworking skills as well. So when I teach somebody how to do woodwork, I teach a lot of hand tool use, some of the old traditional techniques from 1800s type thing. It's just fun, right? So I'll work with somebody on, let's say, a hand plane. Okay? And that hand plane is, it's easy to see how it works. It's hard to actually do it. So what I'll do is I'll actually guide the person's hands at first and guide their body and get them standing in the right position. And when they're standing in that right position, then I can kind of help them move along. So I'm guiding them. I'm actually pushing on their hands. I'm holding their elbows into their body. I'm guiding them as they move down the wood. And they're actually supposed to walk with it. You lock your body in place, and you just kind of walk with that hand plane. Rather than using your arms and your shoulders to move it, you use your entire body to move the thing. So then the next step would be, okay, you've established these procedures, and now I'm going to back off my guidance a little bit. So instead of helping guide you in terms of how to walk, maybe I'll stand on the other side of the board and help you hold your hands. And then I'll back off on the hand holding, and quite literally, and then I'll let you do it yourself, that type of thing. So I'm fading that guidance out. This happens a lot of time with kids that like trying to learn how to eat, right? So you guide the spoon into their mouth, and then eventually you kind of just shadow them, right? You follow their hands as they're putting the spoon into their mouth, but then you don't have to be there at all. So you're fading out that guidance. A fun example of this is like teaching kids numbers, right? So let's look at an example here. So fading from items to a number. So maybe the kid can count, right? 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. There's 7 items. Yeah, there's 7 items there. All right, so the kid can count. There's 7 items, but they don't do well with numbers. So let's look at what we can do with that. So let's take those 7 items and organize them as a 7, and then ask the kid to count that. All right, say, how many are there? 7. You say, you're right, there's 7, and look, that number is a 7. Now we're going to go a step further. Now it's really hard to tell, or actually not in this one, so not hard to tell, but now we added that line, right? So it's actually a 7. Okay. Now we're going to start even more fading here, and we're going to slowly fade out those green dots. Now, for the sake of space, I didn't do 37 steps. I did just one more step here, but you'll get the idea. So those green dots are getting more faint, so they're disappearing. There's still 7 there, and so the kid should now be focusing on the fact that those 2 lines make a number 7. And then you can conclude with a 7. Right? So they were able to say 7 in that one context. They knew what 7 was, 7 items, right? And then now we're changing that into a number 7, which means the same thing. Right? So there's a fading procedure for you. We can do fading in reading and phonics, right? So in some phonics-based approaches, namely the Siegfried approach, Engelmann's approach, he has, I can't remember how many letters it is, but there's like, I can't remember, 30 or 40 letters, right, that he teaches kids, because he teaches the sounds first. So at SH, S is one sound, S, and H is another sound, but SH is its own sound, sh. Okay, so we actually teach using Engelmann's approach. You teach SH as one letter, like that. Okay? And then you fade that out slowly into this. So now you've taught the kid that SH always means shh. But that's not how to write it. You don't connect the S and the H. You actually leave them separate, like what's at the end of this fading example. So you slowly fade out those letters, and you separate them. They're close together at first, and then you have a little bit of space, and a little bit more space, and then a little bit more space until it's like it should be. So now the kid knows how to pronounce it. They treat it as its own letter at first, and then later they learn that it's not its own letter. It's just those 2 letters together make a sound. We can also fade verbal prompts. This is something I do again in woodworking when I'm telling people what to do. So when I'm doing that guidance on the hand plane, the guidance actually fades into a verbal prompt. And I say, all right, hand down, shoulders up, move your hips and walk, not push, and walk. And then I can fade those out and say, okay, hands down. Right? So in other words, you're pushing down with your hands, right? And then you can fade out those particular verbal prompts. And eventually all you have to do is say, all right, go plane that piece of wood. It really means 10 different things. The 10 different things you have to do. And I started out with physically guiding them, right? And then I moved that into verbal guiding, and our verbal prompts, and then I faded out those verbal prompts. And every once in a while, you still have to remind people. Say, oh, what procedure am I working? Oh, yeah, that's right. I got to do that next. I got to do that next step. And it's like, so I'll make that verbal statement. So, and then, like we already talked about, from one setting, from a one-on-one setting, so you can fade the context from maybe a kid will answer to the request of what's your name. So, hi, what's your name, right? Maybe they'll do that in a one-on-one setting. They'll answer properly, but maybe they won't do it in a group setting. So you can slowly fade that. And it's really straightforward. Add another person, and another, and change context a little bit. Next thing you know, the kid's answering the question in the presence of a lot of people and not an issue. This is often how kind of teaching works. A lot of times you start teaching in front of a small group of people. Not always, but sometimes, like at the university level. You kind of start in front of a small group, and then later you add more and more and more and more. Okay? And then you can be lecturing in front of 200, 300, 400 people. It's no big deal, right? So you're just fading from one setting to another. So let's look at some of the factors that are associated with this. First off, we have to identify the final desired stimulus. What is the goal that you're trying to transfer the control to? Make sure that that stimulus represents the real world, right? In which you want the behavior to occur. If I want a kid to respond to the statement of "What's your name?" Then I'm not gonna just say, "Hey, who are you?" Right? Maybe you will, maybe you won't. But that's not a real sort of. Bad example. Sorry. That's really one of those things. Who are you? Maybe that does work. All right. But you want that final desired stimulus to match exactly what the real world is like. So again, in my woodworking stuff, the final desired stimulus is to see a bumpy board. All right. So that's the stimulus, and then know what to do with your plane, right? And then actually go out and plane it and smooth that board out. Okay? When we're dealing with the prompts. So we're going to, again, oftentimes we fade out the prompts, right? So the prompt is use an effective prompt at the beginning, right? And if that does not evoke the response that you want, right, then fading from there on out is not going to work. In other words, this simply says you need to have a good discriminative stimulus. It has to be a real ST. It has to be one that already basically cues the appropriate response. All sorts of types of prompts here, physical ones, gestural ones, modeling, verbal, environmental, so on and so forth. All of those things I've kind of given examples of already. Gestures are interesting ones where you're just kind of signaling or hinting that a particular response is what you want, and you can fade that gesture out. Modeling, showing somebody what to do. Verbal, we've already talked about. Environmental, we've already talked about. We can also talk about something in the environment to make the response more likely. Trying to think of a good example of this one. I'm kind of drawing a blank here, but I think of this in terms of self-management, really, and it's not a perfect example of fading, but it'll work. On my computer, you may have heard the little thingy go off, right? The bing, right? I got a couple of different sounds that are on there. One of them is for my schedule, if I've got a meeting coming up or something like that. So I have added that stimulus to the environment, right? That stimulus has pretty good control over my behavior. Ultimately, in fact, pretty good, and you guys are probably laughing because you know that I'm always late to class, right? But that's kind of the example that I'm getting at here, is that I've got a signal that says, hey, it's time to go to class, right? And it makes a particular noise. Ultimately, I should just know when to go to class, right? But because I get wrapped up in here doing stuff like recording lectures or failing to work on your test, or I don't know, just drinking coffee, whatever it is, right? But I'll go to class and then I'll be a little late. The idea is that prompt in the environment is going to make my response of being on time more likely. Right? Some of the other stuff you can do with fading is to take a particular discriminative stimulus and make it more obvious. So that one of the things that I've done with my email actually is, how on my email client all my emails are bolded if they're unread. Well, I changed it from just bold regular black font to bright blue. So now an unread email sticks out like a sore thumb. It's brighter than the blue that's on this slide. And it just sticks out there and says, oh, this needs your attention. And believe it or not, every couple of months I change the color. So the next color that I have on my list is hot pink. So hot pink is coming up. So that's the next one that's going to cue me to make the particular response of checking that email. Right? And it's just about making that discriminative stimulus more obvious. As is true with most of this particular field, people want to know answers to questions like, how many steps does it take to fade a stimulus? Well, you know what? There is no rule. As many as it takes. I mean, that's the answer. How many steps? Well, as many as you need to make it happen. There is no rule. It doesn't say you have to have 7 steps or 10 steps or 20 steps. Basically, what you have to do is simply watch the performance. If the new stimulus, the one that you're fading to, has control over the behavior, you're successful. If it doesn't, add more steps. Try and break it down a little further. Right? Too many errors indicates that if the child's not making the appropriate responses. I'm going to use an example here of having them choose a color of pen. So you got 2 colors of pens, or multiple colors of pens or something like that, and you're having them identify a green pen or something, and they keep choosing the wrong one. Maybe you're asking them, and maybe you didn't make enough steps between the color green and the fact that the pen has a color as well. Right? Maybe you didn't teach enough examples or something like that, and that's essentially what we're talking about here. So if the kid's making a lot of errors, chances are you're taking too big a step. Right? You're making your changes too large. So if you go back to that example of the 7s, right? So maybe if I just went from the group of 7 dots to the a very faded out 7 dots in the pattern of a 7 with a 7 written over it, maybe that's too big of a step. Maybe they won't be able to say the word 7 when you show them that stimulus. Maybe they will, but if they don't, then you haven't added enough steps. And the other pitfall here is that too many steps will produce dependence on the prompts. You're going to be, they're going to require some sort of prompt in order to continue. So you want to teach, you're trying to teach them that skill of generalizing. That's really what this is about, is kind of teaching that generalization skill. And if you do too much support, this is like helping somebody too much, then it's going to backfire on you. All right. That's pretty much it for fading. I mean, your book goes into a couple of other details, so feel free to read through those. Right. So let's jump into shaping. This is kind of a fun one. This is one that we're all going to be very familiar with. Okay. So shaping. The idea is with shaping, we're going to create a new response. Typically, we talk about shaping in the context of creating new behavior or complex behavior that hasn't happened before. And this is one of those procedures that you can use to get new behavior, because that's always a challenge that we have in behavior analysis is looking at answering the question of how do you create a new behavior? If you can only reinforce behavior that's already happened, how do you create new ones? Well, shaping is one of those. Another one is going to be chaining, and we'll look at that in a second. Right? So the definition of shaping is simple. It's the reinforcing of successive approximations of desired behavior. So successive approximations simply means as you get closer, you're going to get a reinforcer. Right? So we're going to start out at level 1, whatever level 1 is, and you're going to get a reinforcer for level 1, and then next time, you're not going to give you a reinforcer for level 1, you're going to have to get to level 2. Right? You're going to get closer to that response. An example, a quick example here is with a dog, teaching them to sit on their hind legs and kind of beg, or something like that. We call it sit pretty, so with Pixel we say sit pretty, right? So what the idea is, she sits on her bum and then she puts her front paws in the air and she kind of just dangles them out in front of her. It looks really cute, right? So we say sitting pretty. So the first step was to sit. Okay, so once she sat, she was good. Next thing she had to do was kind of rear up, right? So she had to rear up on her hind legs, but not stand up, just kind of just lean back to where she's vertical and she's still on her bum and her rear legs, but her front legs are in the air. So in order to earn the reinforcer, she had to not only sit now, but she had to rear a little bit. And the next step was to get her paws kind of hanging in the right fashion. So now she never gets reinforced just for, if you say sit pretty, for just sitting. She has to go through all those things. So we created a new behavior. Right? So we start out with an individual behavior, with one behavior, and we can shape it to look completely different in order to achieve the goal behavior. The next step that we actually did with the sit pretty thing was we had her stand. Right? So now we train the one behavior of sit, then we shaped that into sit pretty, and then the next step is to, when we say stand, she has to then stand up from that sit pretty position. So now when we say stand up, she just kind of rears back and then stands on her hind legs and dangles her front ones out in front of her, and it's like sitting pretty, but she's actually standing. So we took one behavior of sitting and completely changed that into standing with your paws kind of dangling to look cute. Right? It's a completely different looking behavior, but that was the goal behavior. That's what we wanted. Right? The game that all of us played as a kid was a shaping game. the hot and cold game. That's shaping, right? So there's other names for it, but when I was growing up, it was hot cold. So as you got closer to the particular thing, it would say, "Oh, you're getting hot, you're getting warmer, you're getting warmer," and you never say you're getting warmer when you're not, right? Because then that'll get you walking in the wrong direction. But when you get back, when you do achieve it, then, or when you do really get closer, then you get your reinforcer. That's that successive approximation, right? Basically, this combines with extinction to produce new behavior. Old behaviors aren't going to work anymore. New behaviors are. So you got to try, you try your old behavior, but it's not good enough anymore. Now you got to get something else in there. It's something a little extra, and then you reinforce the something extra, right? Getting a little closer to that goal behavior, and then you extinguish all the other ones. Okay? At least in that context. So, for example, with Pixel, we say sit pretty. Sit pretty is a discriminative stimulus to mean sit pretty. It doesn't mean just sit. It doesn't mean stand. It doesn't mean lay down. It doesn't roll. It doesn't mean roll over. It doesn't mean shake. All of those behaviors will happen on occasion. She'll try all sorts of shit when we say she's sit pretty, but then we extinguish those. We keep those on extinction. We do not reinforce those other behaviors. Only once she sits pretty, then she gets a reinforcer. We'll treat or something. Baby talk is a great example of this one. Right? Think about babies, right? And think about adults and how they interact with babies. The very first step with a baby is just going, bleh, right? And everybody's going to get excited. The first time they verbalize something, everybody's going to get excited and go, ooh, look at the baby, they're talking and blah, 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 blah. And the next time they're just going to have to do something a little bit more important, right? They're going to have to maybe say mom, or mama, or dada, or something, and they have to get close to it, right? They don't have to actually be perfectly enunciating the word dad or whatever. They have to just simply, nah, right? And you're like, oh my gosh, you said dada! You get all excited about it. But now, that just grunting is not going to earn that kiddo anything anymore, right? And then in the future, you're going to have to get closer to saying actually dad or daddy or whatever it is that you're trying to get him to say, and you slowly extinguish the old ones, the ones that didn't work, the ones that worked originally but don't work now. We extinguish those and we make a new requirement built into it. And I mean, theoretically, it's not completely agreed upon yet, but this is one of those major processes that are involved in learning a language. This is part of what happens. All right, what can be shaped? Right? The topography, the form of the response. This is a painting of Dali by Dali, and if you know Dali, his paintings are quite odd, to say the least. And the more you look at that, the more odd that's going to get. But the idea is that he didn't start out doing that day one. He had a kind of pattern and a kind of way of looking at the world that was kind of twisted. And he started to put that on canvas. And then over time, it started to get more profound. And there were certain themes that always started to appear. And if you're familiar with some of Dali's paintings, I want you to look at the shadow. Right? And in that shadow of Dali's face is actually a couple of other paintings. That shadow that he has in there appears in all sorts of his paintings. So that topography, the way that response looks, got shaped up. And the response is how he painted it, right? So the sort of shading techniques he used, and the odd caricatures, and the what do you call it? I want to say enhanced, but that's the wrong word. I don't know, like his ear, how big his ear is compared to everything else and all that stuff. There's a term for that, but I don't recall what it is. Anyway, the topography itself got shaped up, right? How it looks, and it improves each time, right? So it's maybe, but only the ones that do improve will earn the reinforcers, right? The frequency, how often you make the response, okay? This stuff is called marquetry, right? So I'll get to the duration here in a second. So that pictures of marquetry, we'll come back to that in a second. Frequency, so how often you make the particular response. You may not talk very often in class at first, but then over time you probably talk more and more and more. That's basically your frequency of response being shaped. Right? The duration of a response can be shaped. And this marquetry, this is an unbelievably intricate piece of marquetry, but marquetry is taking small pieces of wood and inlaying them with each other and making painting or making art, like designs or something like that. So in this particular design, start looking at how many different pieces of wood are here, right? There's a little one there. There's a little one there. There's one beside it. There's another one beside it. There's one right there. There's one right there. That's one. That's one. That's one. There's like 8 pieces in here. There's a bunch here. And then, okay, now let's go out here and let's look at all those and all those. And each one of those little lines is another piece of wood, right? So there's an extraordinary amount of effort that went into doing in this. And this is a floor, by the way, is huge, okay? And the amount of work that went into this is hundreds and hundreds of hours. So in order to get the artist, the person that did this, you got to think about how they started doing their marquetry. They didn't start out doing gigantic floors like this and being successful. They started out with something small and they worked for a little bit and took their time on it, and they were reinforced for that. And the next thing they needed to do something a little more complex. So not only was the duration getting shaped, but the topography was. And over time, you get to that point where you can work on something for a long time in order to earn the reinforcer, the completed project, and that it looks good. And this is an absolutely gorgeous piece of marquetry, and you can see that it turned out just awesome. And to think about the multiple thousands of pieces of wood that are in that, and how much time that took to cut each one out and design each one and fit it and sand it and seal it and do all those types of things. It took a lot of work in order to make that happen. Latency is another example, right, from a thing that can be shaped. So time from the onset of a stimulus to emitting of behavior. This is something that we learn as part of, an example here is relationship stuff. So you learn that, the onset of a stimulus, somebody may accuse you of something, or somebody may be in an argument with you, and you learn over time to keep your mouth shut and listen for a few minutes, right? Listen to what the other person has to say. Don't just start arguing immediately, right? So that latency, that time from onset of a stimulus to emitting of your response to it, so you're reacting to the person, right? So we can shape up that as well. Intensity, how hard you work at something. So how fast you run, how much weight you lift, all of that stuff. That's all things that are shaped. And with the weightlifting, people are like, oh, it's just muscle building. No, you're right, it is muscle building, but there's shaping involved too, right? You don't just build your muscles and stick at the same weight. You now need more weight in order to earn your reinforcer. Your reinforcer is maybe the feeling or the success that you get from lifting, or even the muscle building itself. So that's your reinforcer, but you have to do more weight to do that. You're building up the intensity. You have to push harder. You have to lift more pounds, so to speak. All right, factors that affect shaping. Identify what you want right away. If you don't identify that terminal behavior, the goal behavior, the one you're shooting for, then how are you going to know what a successive approximation is of that? Right? In order to identify that behavior, you also have to use an operational definition. So what does the behavior look like? So you have to be able to identify it when you see it, and you have to be able to identify when the person is getting closer to it. Every characteristic, the topography, the frequency, the duration, the latency, and the intensity, all of those things should be identified clearly. And keep in mind, those are the properties of any behavior. All behavior has topography, all behavior has frequency, and most behavior has duration, most behavior has latency, and so on and so forth. So you have to look at each one of those things. Which ones are you going to shape? Are you going to shape all of them? Are you going to shape some of them? Each one of those things should be identified in order for shaping to be, in order for you to be successful at using shaping. Right off the bat, with the initial behavior, you need to choose something that's related to the terminal behavior somehow. Okay, with Pixel, we didn't teach her to sit pretty by having her jump in a lake. So it would be really hard to shape up jumping in a lake to sitting pretty. They're just not related to each other, right? But some type of sitting or standing, those are related to each other, so we can link those very easily. So that's kind of the idea, is find a simple connection. It's like with the marquetry stuff in the previous example. It starts out with just some basic woodworking skills, right? Maybe some small inlay techniques, and we're going to reinforce more complex use of those basic skills. Okay? Identify the steps. Before you ever start, list out the steps ahead of time. That way, and the idea what we're talking about with steps here is the whatchamacallits. Oh, sorry, just drawing a blank for a second. The steps are really those things that you're going to look for to reinforce, the successive approximations. Do you have to follow every single one of your steps? Not necessarily. The learner may jump a step or two, and you've got to be ready to reinforce that approximation. It's like, ooh, okay, cool. Pixel skipped that intermediary steps, and now she's she's getting closer to standing or something like that. So I'm going to reinforce that. Okay, so if you've listed those out ahead of time, then it's easier to know when you're going to go ahead and reinforce them. When you're doing this, you need to make sure that you establish each step. Okay? And again, you kind of let the learner guide you in terms of where they're at in the steps, but you literally reinforce each approximation several times, if you need to. Okay, that's the other thing. You need to be reflexive to that, and maybe the person gets through their steps very quickly. But if we go back to the marquetry example, you don't just do a little bit of inlay and then move on to a challenge like that one. You do a lot of inlay over and over again. Then you add more species of wood, right? And you try to work with those. And then you add more complex patterns and you work with those. And after 5, 6, 10, 20 years, you get to doing floors like what you saw in that previous picture. One of the other things that you see with shaping is that the person is, remember, shaping also includes some sort of extinction as well, right? It's similar to the fading type stuff in that sense. And the idea is that we're going to extinguish one response. We're no longer going to accept a response in that particular context, or we're not going to accept a particular response, and it's a new response that we want. So what happens is sometimes people get stuck. Just think about that hot-cold game, right? Sometimes you got stuck when you were playing hot and cold. You didn't know what to do. You didn't know where to go. And you just kind of sat there and went, I don't know what to do. This is frustrating, right? So you're doing that. Well, guess what? You've lost variation in behavior. The moment you lose that variation in behavior, you're no longer going to be able to move the person a step forward. Now you're going to have to back things up, because if you can't move them forward, you're never going to reach that terminal behavior, the one you want. So you're going to have to back things up, right? Back up a step and make that change less large. So if we're doing the marquetry stuff, again, we started, maybe the person was working with some additional species, but never really got on to, you tried to ask for complex patterns and it never worked. So you go back and you try and get them to keep practicing some more. Keep trying some successes and then add another smaller step. Instead of going from a complex, going from basic marquetry to complex round stuff like what you see in the picture, you could ask them to do complex straight patterns, right? Maybe that works. And then from the complex straight patterns, you could get to the complex round ones. Okay, that's about it for shaping. So let's move on to chaining, right? Chaining is another way to produce new responses in a sense, or actually I shouldn't say new responses, but complex behavior. With chaining, we kind of looked at this a little bit already, and your book has kind of hinted at it, but we'll go over it in a little more detail here. It's a sequence of discriminative stimuli and responses. Right? So an SD leads to a response, leads to a reinforcer. Okay? So then we look at that next level. Each response is actually an SD for the next response. Okay? So think of driving your car. So there's all sorts of SDs that are, it's basically a big chain. So there's all sorts of things that are happening there. So you got to get your keys. Well, getting your keys is a discriminative stimulus for walking to the car. Walking to the car reinforces getting your keys and is also a discriminative stimulus for putting your keys in the door. Putting your keys in the door is a discriminative, or reinforces, walking to the car, blah, blah, blah. You see the idea here. Each response is also a discriminative stimulus for the next response, right? And then the consequences are the response themselves. So it's basically it just cycles itself up here, right? And then you continue and you continue and continue, and eventually you're driving the car, right? So you think of all those little behaviors that you do when you're driving a car. Really, it's just one big chain. You tend to look at your mirrors in one particular pattern most of the time. All right, left, right, middle, or right, middle, left, or middle, left, right, however you typically do it, it becomes a certain pattern. Every time you look in your driver's side mirror, you end up looking in your passenger side mirror. That is an example of a chain. Right? Ultimately, this leads to one big reinforcer at the end of your chain, and that big reinforcer would be getting to your destination if you're thinking about a car. So think of some examples, right? Right off the bat, I want you to think of some on your own, but the one that I'm thinking of, putting on your clothes is a chain. Cigarette smoking is a chain. For me, believe it or not, lecturing is a chain. All right, each stimulus is each line is a stimulus which produces a response. That response then cues me to talk about something else or come up with an example. That example then cues me to talk about the next thing, and so on and so forth. Right. So there's all sorts of chains that are out there. So I want you guys to think of some of your own behaviors that may be chained. Right. And again, look at your book while you're thinking about these things, because there's some visual stimuli in your book that are useful to helping understand chains. Right. So let's look at a little bit of methods here with regard to chains. Okay, total task presentation. This is where the other thing that I failed to mention here and failed to put into slides is something called a task analysis. It's actually on the next slide, but task analysis is where you just list out all those different things that are involved in a complex behavior. Think about putting on your clothes. There's a big list of things to put on your pants. Okay, you got to get the pants out of the drawer. You got to step into one. You got to put them down to where you can step into them properly, right? So, but you don't step into both legs at the same time. You step into one, then you step into the other, then you pull them up, then you zip them up or button them up, and so on and so forth, right? So you have to identify all those little steps before you can start using a chain. And now, backward chaining is probably the easiest way to develop a complex behavior. Right? So let's say we're talking about putting on pants. Now I'm going to use just regular old pair of Wranglers or whatever. They've got a zip front, not a button. Okay. So with backward chaining, what we're going to do is we're going to identify. Oh, I never even said anything about total task. Let me back up. Sorry about that. So total task chaining is where you present all of the tasks at once. Here's step 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, and it leads to this. So go do it. This works really well with kids that are highly functioning, are not developmentally disabled in any way. They can follow instructions, they're verbal, that type of thing. So you say, okay, here's your list of it. Here's how you put on your clothes. Go ahead and do it. Right? So you give them all those steps. Say, here's what you need to do, and off they go. Hopefully that will get them in touch with the final reinforcer, which is having their clothes on correctly. Backward chaining works really well for people with mild disabilities, as does the next one, which is forward chaining. But backward chaining is probably the most successful out of all of these, and it's really easy for the kids to learn when you use a backward chaining procedure. So backward chaining procedure, what you're going to do is, let's think about all those steps that are involved in putting your pants on, right? So getting them out, stepping into one leg, pulling it up a little bit, stepping into another leg, and then pulling it up a little bit, and then standing up and pulling them all the way up, right? So each one of these is a step, and then zipping your pants and then buttoning your pants, right? So there's a lot of steps that are involved. And there's arguably more steps in there as well in terms of how do you find them, which ones do you get out, that type of thing. But we're not going to worry about that. So with backward chaining, we're going to take all those steps. And because we're teaching the person, we're going to do everything but the last step. And then we're going to have the kid do the last step. So we're going to talk them through what we're doing, get the pants out, we're going to pull them up for them, we're going to zip them up, and then we're going to have them do the button. Now the next trial, the next time we go to put pants on, we're going to have them do the last 2 steps. And the next time they'll do the last 3 steps, and so on and so forth. You're building that chain backwards. All right, so the reason this is very successful is it puts you in contact with the reinforcer immediately, right? So, and we know about the immediacy of reinforcement, and it makes it more effective. So think about the kid that's learning how to do the putting on their pants. Excuse me, I take a drink. The kid that's learning how to put on their pants that doesn't know how to do it, when they're going to get a reinforcer just for buttoning the very last step. So they immediately get reinforced. Next time you're going to make them work a little harder. Okay? So you're buttoning, and so now they have to zip and button. Right? Then they get a reinforcer. But right off the bat, you started with a reinforcer, and it was the natural reinforcer of having your pants on. And you have probably had some contrived ones in there too, in terms of saying, oh, good job, you did it, yay, all that stuff. Right? And then the idea is that you fade out your assistance as you go along. Right? And you may have to do some verbal prompts in there that you want to fade out, and so on and so forth. But the backward chaining works really well, and ultimately they will do it all themselves. Forward chaining is just the opposite. You have them do the first task, and you do the remaining ones. Go get your pants. And then they go get their pants, and you put them on for them. Next thing you say, go get your pants and put them on the floor. Right, so they get them ready to go. Okay, they get their pants and they get them ready to go. And then the next step is, all right, go get your pants and put them, put them on the floor and then put one leg in, and they keep working through that. Okay? If you follow the link that's on here, I don't know if it's even legible. So let me see if I can. So anyway, in this link, it's an example of a chaining procedure. So let's take a look at it. Okay, so this is a visual stimulus of the types of basically a chain of what's going on. So he's showing you how that whole chain is developed, right? So what he's got is a big chunk of wood here, right? It don't really matter what type of wood it is. In fact, he takes you through a procedure for how do you get the wood to that status anyway, right? So what he's doing is he's shaping it out here first. He's kind of making the bottom of that bowl, right? And then this is just called roughing in, right? So he's just roughing in the general shape of the bowl. So you can read through this if you want. So you can see here that the shavings are coming off. You can see what he's doing. This is the bottom of the, believe it or not, it's the bottom of the bowl. Right? Kind of hard to see. You can see it in this picture, how it's kind of developing, right? So you can see that roundness that's showing up in here. This picture, it's really bad. He's just kind of showing the grain and showing where some of the problems are. But what you also see here is he's got this little flat spot, and that becomes important for learning how to use the tool, but we'll get back to that here in a minute. Again, he's just rounding this thing off and making the bottom of the bowl. A little bit more detail, he's adding that shape. You can see how that shape's starting to develop here, right? So the shape of the bowl, well done, using lots of safety equipment. That's a that's a shaped response, I'll tell you that much. But look at the wood that's coming off here. So he's doing a lot of work. He's getting that shape. And it's turning really nice. So there's that flat spot we were looking at earlier. He's actually doing some things in there to make it easier for when he gets to doing the other side of the bowl, the inside of the bowl. So he's, again, picture's kind of hard to see, but here we go. As you can see what's happened. That started out as just a big round. Now he's created that bowl. And there's this little flat spot down here that we keep talking about. He's going to flip that around and use that on the other side. So now he flips it around, right? This whole thing gets flipped, and this flat spot gets attached to this side of the lathe, and now he's going to start cutting the inside of that bowl out. He's got a special tool for doing that, and it's a cool tool, but what he's doing is slowly cutting the inside of the bowl out, and now with this removal tool, he has popped out this big center section, and this removal tool saves the wood so you can do another bowl out of it later, so it just removes this big chunk out of it. Right? So now he's got the big chunk out, and he's cleaning up the inside of the bowl. Okay? So that's that, and there you go. So that's that whole chain. Those are all those steps. But there's a lot of individual behaviors involved in those steps. And with this type of thing, it's actually learned from a forward chaining perspective, because you have to start at the beginning. You really can't start at the end with this. You have to have, you have to make the bowl before you can finish the bowl. So that type of thing. So there's an example of chaining for you. All right, factors affecting chaining. Number one, task analysis. Make sure you've done a good one. Every possible step you can possibly think of should be in your task analysis. Sometimes you can skip some tasks, but you need all of them in there right off the bat. Right? Develop cues to help guide mastery of that chain. Right? Are there visual cues? Are there written cues? Are there visual cues? Are there self-instructions? What are those procedures? The guy that's building the bowl, there's probably a lot of self-instruction going on. Right? He put the instructions on the web page for a visual prompt for somebody else, right? So you've got that visual prompt. You can go back to it and look, right? And say, oh, I know what I need to be doing next. I'm going to be building my tenon so I can grab it and then start turning the inside of the bowl. Self-instructions. The guy in there is probably telling himself, oh, okay, I got to smooth this out. Oh, okay, I'm going to remove the centerpiece. Oh, okay, I'm going to do the tenon or whatever, But it's self-instructions, right? So lots of cues make chaining easier. If you can, model the chain while describing the steps. So put on your pants, or that's kind of a bad example, put on your shirt or something if you're teaching somebody how to put on a shirt, or if you're turning a bowl, right, like that guy was. When I teach woodworking stuff, I do an example and describe what I'm doing as I'm doing it. Now, I don't do big lathe work like that, but I do small lathe work, and I've taught people how to turn pens and make other things like bottle stoppers and goofy little things like that. And the idea is, as I'm doing it, I'm telling them what I'm going through. I'm verbalizing those self-instructions and kind of teaching them each step and then giving them those self-instructions that I use along the way, as well as modeling what to do. If you're trying to teach someone else, you often provide a verbal prompt. For example, I was teaching a group of people, really, somewhat recently, to do to make a. Well, let's see how many of them chose. A couple of them chose a French-style rolling pin, and another one chose an American-style rolling pin. And if you're not into baking, that makes no it makes no sense to you. If you are into baking, you're like, oh yeah, I know what he's talking about. But the idea is that I was teaching people how to make rolling pins, and I've made French-style or American-style, and I prefer the French. So I told the guys, hey, I prefer you do a French, but it's up to you and what type of rolling pin that you want. And so what I did was I put the chain on the board. So here's the things you need to do. Here's the steps we're going to need to take. Here's how you flatten this piece. Here's how you make this handle. Here's how you do X, Y, and Z, right? But sometimes they would get stuck and they'd just be sitting there looking at the rolling pin going, oh, I don't exactly know what's going on with this. I'm kind of stuck. And I'd provide a verbal prompt and I would say, handle next. So, or finger spaces. Right? So finger spaces are on an American style rolling pin. You get a little handle that's on the edge, right? So you need a spot for your fingers to go, so it doesn't crush the pie dough with your fingers, right? So you got to have those finger spaces in there. So I would prompt them with that finger space stuff. Say, okay, don't forget to measure your finger spaces and get room for that, and gouge out those areas first, and then finish out your handle, right? So you would provide a verbal prompt. If they do something wrong, then you would typically want to move them back a step. And that got a little hard. I ran into that problem with having people make a rolling pin because one guy made a big mistake and ruined his rolling pin. So he had to back up from the beginning, which that was a big problem because it took like a day to get to where he was at. And he screwed it up and ruined the whole thing. But we had to back it up, right? So we had to move back a step until that link was completed accurately. And he did. He eventually got it. He came back in the next day and we continued training one-on-one, and he got through it the second time, and he finally succeeded and was able to finish out that rolling pin the way he wanted to. Okay. Fade out extra steps as quickly as possible. That way the natural reinforcers take over, right? It makes the chain completely natural, makes it stronger, it makes it not dependent on other cues. You know, I get a pet peeve is GPSs. I love GPSs. They're great. You know, the sat-nav stuff, right? They're awesome. They make it really easy, but they also make you completely dependent upon them. Because if you're used to using one, that's all you're going to use. You don't have to memorize the city streets. You don't have to memorize the layout of a town. You don't have to memorize how to get from 456 Southeast Place up to, I don't know what other, up to Military Avenue or whatever over in Seattle. I can't remember the name of it, but I'm just thinking of an example of how I used to have to drive over there. But with a GPS, you just listen to what it tells you. It's basically giving you all the chains and giving you all these prompts. Make left or turn left in 500 meters, or however it says its little thing. Or keep left and keep right and keep left to make a right and all those things. And you just follow those little stupid little commands. But you never learn how to do it on your own. Right? So fading out those cues as quickly as you can is an important thing. Get rid of those extra steps, and then you learn how to do it on your own. Okay. That's pretty much it for those 3 chapters, kind of all wrapped up into one there. So enjoy your test, and I'll talk to you again. Thank you much.